The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle, as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at the tall windows of her private study. Her fingers traced the cool glass while she watched the early mist rise from the ancient oak trees that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Today felt different from all the other mornings she had spent in this same spot. There was a heaviness in the air that seemed to press against her chest, making each breath feel deliberate and measured. William had left before dawn for what everyone knew would be his final official engagement as the Duke of Cambridge. The transition that had been years in preparation was finally happening. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, was shifting in ways that would change everything they had known about their lives together. Catherine had always understood this day would come, but understanding something intellectually and living through it emotionally were entirely different experiences. The sound of footsteps in the corridor broke her contemplation. Sarah, her longtime personal assistant, appeared in the doorway with a gentle knock. The woman's usually bright demeanor seemed subdued, as if she too could feel the significance of what was unfolding. Sarah carried a silver tray with tea and a small stack of correspondence that had arrived with the morning post. Even the simple ritual of morning tea felt weighted with meaning today. Catherine accepted the delicate china cup with both hands, grateful for its warmth. The correspondence could wait. Everything could wait, really, except for the inexorable march of time that was carrying them toward this moment of profound change. She had always prided herself on being prepared, on studying every protocol and understanding every expectation that came with her role. But no amount of preparation could have readied her for the emotional reality of watching her husband transform before her eyes. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of private meetings, constitutional discussions, and ceremonial preparations. William had been different during this time, more serious, more reflective. She had caught him several times standing in doorways as if he were memorizing rooms, or pausing longer than usual when saying goodnight to their children. It was as if he were already beginning to say goodbye to the person he had been. Their children had sensed something too, though they were too young to fully understand the magnitude of what was happening. George, with his serious eyes that seemed older than his years, had asked more questions than usual about royal duties and what it meant to serve the people. Charlotte had become more clingy, wanting extra bedtime stories and seeking comfort in small gestures of affection. Louis, still young enough to live fully in the present moment, continued his cheerful chaos, perhaps providing the most normal element in their increasingly formal world. Catherine thought about the conversation she and William had shared just 3 nights ago, sitting in the garden after the children were asleep. They had talked about duty and sacrifice, about the price of service and the weight of legacy. William had spoken about his grandfather and father, about the lessons they had taught him and the example they had set. But mostly, they had talked about what this change would mean for them as a family, as partners, as 2 people who had chosen each other long before they fully understood what that choice would require. The telephone on her desk rang, pulling her back to the present moment. It was William, calling from his car as he traveled between engagements. His voice sounded tired but determined, carrying that particular tone he used when he was pushing through difficult emotions by focusing entirely on the task at hand. He wanted to confirm the timing for the evening, to make sure she understood how important it was that she be there for what everyone was calling the moment. After ending the call, Catherine found herself thinking about their wedding day more than a decade ago. She remembered the weight of her dress, the sound of the crowds, the feeling of William's hand in hers as they made promises that seemed both incredibly personal and impossibly public. She had known then that their love story would always belong partly to the world, but she hadn't fully grasped how completely their private moments would be shaped by public duty. The afternoon brought a series of final preparations. Palace staff moved with quiet efficiency, arranging flowers, adjusting lighting, and ensuring that every detail would be perfect for the cameras that would capture this historic moment. Catherine chose her outfit carefully, understanding that every choice would be analyzed and remembered. The deep blue dress felt appropriate, serious enough for the solemnity of the occasion, but with a warmth that reflected her genuine emotion. As evening approached, she found herself in the same spot where the day had begun, looking out at the grounds that would soon witness history. The setting sun painted everything in golden hues, and she thought about all the royal couples who had stood in these same rooms, facing their own moments of transition and change. The continuity was both comforting and overwhelming. William would return soon, and together they would walk to the place where everything would change. She knew that tonight, the world would watch as they said goodbye to one chapter of their lives and stepped into another. But what the cameras wouldn't capture, what the world couldn't see, was the private conversation that would happen later, when they were alone and could speak not as future monarchs but simply as William and Kate, two people who had promised to face whatever came next together. The sound of cars on the gravel drive announced his return. Catherine straightened her shoulders, checked her reflection one final time, and prepared to step into the moment that would define the rest of their lives. Outside, the world was already beginning to gather, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. William stepped out of the black Range Rover and immediately felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon him. The crowd had grown throughout the day, with people traveling from across the country to witness what many were calling the most significant royal transition in decades. Barriers lined the approach to the castle, and behind them stood families with children on shoulders, elderly couples who remembered his grandmother's coronation, and young people who had grown up seeing him as the future of the monarchy. The afternoon had been a blur of final meetings and last-minute preparations. William had spent 2 hours with his father in the king's private study, a conversation that had covered everything from constitutional matters to deeply personal reflections on duty and family. His father's eyes had held a mixture of pride and concern, understanding better than anyone what William was about to face. They had embraced at the end, a moment of pure father-son connection that transcended all royal protocol. Now, walking toward the entrance where Catherine waited, William felt the full magnitude of the transition settling on his shoulders. Each step carried him further from the life he had known, and closer to a destiny that had been written in history books before he was even born. The late afternoon light caught the ancient stones of the castle, making them glow as if lit from within, and he thought about all the monarchs who had walked these same paths. Catherine appeared in the doorway, and for a moment the noise of the crowd seemed to fade into the background. She wore the blue dress he had helped her choose, and her smile carried all the strength and support he needed to take the next steps. They had developed a language of looks over the years, a way of communicating volumes with just a glance, and right now her eyes were telling him that whatever came next, they would face it together. Inside, the castle felt different than it ever had before. Staff members who had served his family for decades stood at attention along the corridors, their faces reflecting the historic nature of the moment. William recognized the weight of their presence. These were people who had devoted their lives to serving the crown, and tonight they were witnessing the transfer of that responsibility to a new generation. The private moments before any public ceremony were always the most intense. William and Catherine found themselves in the blue drawing room, a space that had hosted countless important conversations throughout royal history. The formal portraits on the walls seemed to watch over them, and William thought about his grandmother, whose image smiled down from above the fireplace. She had prepared him for this moment in countless ways. Through formal instruction and casual conversation, through example and through gentle guidance. Catherine reached for his hand, and her touch grounded him in the present moment. They talked quietly about the children, who were safely tucked away with their nannies, hopefully sleeping peacefully despite the excitement surrounding the castle. George had asked that morning if everything would be different when he woke up, and William had struggled to find an answer that was both truthful and reassuring for a young boy to hear. The sound of movement in the corridors indicated that the formal procession was about to begin. Palace officials appeared with final instructions and gentle reminders about protocol, though William and Catherine had rehearsed these moments countless times. Still, there was something surreal about the reality of it actually happening, about walking toward a moment that would be recorded in history books and remembered long after they were gone. As they prepared to leave the private space and enter the public eye, William took a moment to look around the room one final time. Tomorrow, when he returned to this space, everything would be different. His title, his responsibilities, his relationship with the world, all of it would have fundamentally changed. Catherine squeezed his hand gently, a reminder that some things, the most important things, would remain constant. The doors opened and they stepped into the corridor where members of the royal household had assembled. The staff had arranged themselves in order of precedence, creating a path that led toward the staterooms where the ceremony would take place. William recognized faces he had known since childhood, people who had been constants in his life through every phase of growing up in the royal family. Their walk through the castle felt like a journey through time itself. Each room held memories, childhood games, formal dinners, Christmas celebrations, and quiet family moments that had shaped who he was. The green drawing room where he had learned to play chess with his grandfather. The oak room where he had practiced his first formal speeches. The grand reception room where he had been photographed for official portraits marking every milestone of his life. Catherine walked beside him with perfect composure, but he could sense the emotion she was carefully controlling. This was her farewell too, to the role she had grown into and mastered over more than a decade. Tomorrow she would wake up with new titles, new responsibilities, and new expectations that would reshape every aspect of her daily life. Yet she moved forward with the grace and dignity that had made the British people embrace her as one of their own. The sound of the crowd outside grew louder as they approached the staterooms. Television crews from around the world had positioned themselves to capture every moment, and William knew that millions of people would be watching this transition unfold. The responsibility of that attention, of being a symbol and example for so many people, was something he had been preparing for his entire life. Yet it still felt overwhelming in its reality. They paused at the final doorway, the threshold between their private preparation and the public ceremony that would change everything. William looked at Catherine one more time, seeing in her eyes all the love, support, and strength that had sustained him through every challenge they had faced together. In a few moments they would step forward into history, but right now they were simply two people who had chosen to face the future as partners. The stateroom had been transformed for this historic evening, with hundreds of carefully placed flowers creating an atmosphere that was both formal and warm. Representatives from around the world filled the elegant space, creating a sea of formal attire and expectant faces. Ambassadors, Commonwealth leaders, and heads of state had traveled great distances to witness this moment, understanding its significance not just for Britain, but for the entire modern monarchy. As William and Catherine entered the room, a profound silence fell over the assembled crowd. The weight of the moment was palpable, and every person present seemed to understand that they were witnessing something that would be remembered for generations. The television cameras, positioned discreetly around the room, would carry this moment to millions of homes around the world, where families were gathering to watch history unfold. William's father stood at the front of the room, wearing the full ceremonial uniform that had been worn by monarchs for centuries. The crown jewels caught the light from the crystal chandeliers, creating sparkles that seemed to dance across the ornate ceiling. But it was the expression on his father's face that captured William's attention, a mixture of pride, solemnity, and deep emotion that spoke to the personal cost of public duty. The ceremony began with words that had been spoken at royal transitions for hundreds of years, yet they felt fresh and immediate in this moment. William thought about his grandmother, who had spoken similar words decades ago when she was barely older than he was now. The continuity of the monarchy, the unbroken chain of service and sacrifice that connected him to centuries of history, felt both inspiring and overwhelming. Catherine stood beside him, her presence both comforting and grounding. He could sense her steady breathing, her calm strength that had sustained him through every challenge they had faced together. She had prepared for this moment just as thoroughly as he had, understanding that her role would transform just as dramatically as his own. The woman who had entered this family as a university student would leave this ceremony as one of the most important figures in the modern world. When the time came for William to speak, his voice carried clearly across the silent room. The words he had practiced countless times took on new meaning when spoken in this setting, surrounded by people who represented every corner of the globe. He spoke about service, about the responsibility he felt to the British people and to the Commonwealth nations that looked to the monarchy for stability and continuity. But it was when he spoke about family, about the support that had brought him to this moment, that emotion began to show in his voice. He thanked his father for the example of dedicated service, his grandmother for the wisdom she had shared throughout his life, and Catherine for the partnership that had made him stronger and better prepared for the challenges ahead. The cameras captured the slight tremor in his voice, the moment when the magnitude of what was happening broke through his carefully maintained composure. The formal transfer of symbols and responsibilities took place with centuries-old precision, each movement choreographed and meaningful. William felt the weight of each new responsibility as it was placed upon him, understanding that these were not just ceremonial objects but representations of the trust being placed in him by millions of people. The crown, when it was finally placed upon his head, felt heavier than he had expected, though he had worn it many times in private rehearsals. Catherine's transformation was equally profound. As new titles were bestowed upon her, she stood with perfect posture and serene expression, but William could see the emotion in her eyes. The woman who had once been nervous about royal protocol was now stepping into a role that would make her one of the most watched and influential women in the world. Her journey from university student to future queen had been extraordinary, but this moment marked the full realization of that transformation. The international guests rose as one when the ceremony reached its crescendo, creating a sound like ocean waves that filled the ornate room. Representatives from nations across 6 continents were acknowledging not just William and Catherine personally, but the institution they now embodied. The Commonwealth realms, European monarchies, and republics alike were witnessing the peaceful transfer of power that represented the best of democratic tradition. When the formal ceremony concluded, there was a moment of complete silence before the applause began. It started slowly, almost hesitantly, then built into something powerful and sustained. William looked out over the room and saw faces that reflected genuine emotion. People who understood that they had witnessed something remarkable, a moment when history had shifted and the future had taken on a new direction. The reception that followed allowed for more personal interactions. Though every conversation was conducted under the watchful eyes of the world's media, William found himself moving through the room with new awareness of how his words and gestures would be interpreted and remembered. Every handshake carried diplomatic significance. Every smile would be analyzed for its meaning and sincerity. Catherine moved through the crowd with natural grace, switching effortlessly between languages as she spoke with various dignitaries. William watched her with admiration, seeing how completely she had embraced her role while never losing the warmth and authenticity that had first drawn him to her years ago at university. She made every person she spoke with feel important and heard, a gift that would serve her well in the role she was now stepping into. As the evening progressed, William began to feel the full reality of what had just occurred. The titles that had been theoretical for so long were now reality. The responsibilities that had seemed distant were now immediate. When he looked in the mirrors that lined the stateroom walls, he saw not just himself, but the reflection of centuries of monarchy, the embodiment of tradition and continuity that millions of people around the world looked to for stability. The ceremony had been flawless, but William knew that the real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, when the cameras were gone and the work of actually fulfilling these new responsibilities began in earnest. The private farewell began after the last of the international guests had departed, and the staterooms had been cleared of cameras and formal ceremony. William and Catherine found themselves in the Oak Room, a smaller, more intimate space where royal families had gathered for generations during moments of personal significance. The contrast between the public ceremony and this private moment was striking. Here, they could finally let down the careful composure they had maintained throughout the evening. Catherine had changed from her formal ceremonial gown into a simpler dress, though she still wore the diamond earrings that had belonged to William's grandmother. They had been a gift earlier that day, passed down as part of the unofficial tradition of sharing family jewelry during important transitions. The weight of them felt symbolic, a tangible connection to the woman who had guided them both through so many years of preparation for this moment. William's father joined them, no longer wearing the ceremonial robes, but still carrying himself with the dignity that came from a lifetime of royal service. The conversation was quiet and deeply personal, touching on memories that stretched back to William's childhood and forward to the responsibilities that now lay ahead. They spoke about the Commonwealth tour that would begin in just 2 weeks, about the state visits that were already being planned, and about the daily rhythm of constitutional duties that would now define William's life. But mostly, they talked about the children. George, Charlotte, and Louis were sleeping peacefully in the nursery wing, protected from the media attention and formal ceremony, but their lives had been fundamentally altered by the events of this evening. William and Catherine had worked hard to maintain as much normalcy as possible in their children's lives, but they understood that this transition would bring new challenges and new levels of public attention. The conversation turned to practical matters, the changes in security arrangements, the modifications that would need to be made to their various residences, and the expansion of staff that would be necessary to handle their new responsibilities. But underlying all these logistical discussions was the emotional reality of what they had just experienced. William had stepped into a role that would define the rest of his life, and Catherine had taken on responsibilities that would make her one of the most scrutinized women in the world. When William's father finally left them alone, the silence that followed felt profound. For the first time all day, William and Catherine could speak without considering how their words might be interpreted by others, without thinking about protocol or ceremony or the expectations of the watching world. They sat together on the antique sofa that had been in this room for more than a century, and for a moment, they were simply two people processing an extraordinary day. Catherine spoke first, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room. She talked about the moment during the ceremony when she had looked out at the assembled crowd and truly understood the magnitude of what was happening. She had felt the weight of history, the responsibility to millions of people, and the profound change that had just occurred in their lives. But she had also felt strength, drawn from the years of preparation and from the knowledge that she and William would face these new challenges together. William listened, holding her hand and feeling grateful for her honesty and insight. He shared his own reflections on the day, talking about the moment when the crown had been placed on his head, and he had felt the full weight of constitutional responsibility settling on his shoulders. He spoke about his thoughts of his grandmother, whose guidance had prepared him for this moment, and about his hopes for the kind of monarch he wanted to become. They talked about their wedding day, remembering how overwhelming it had felt to make personal promises in front of the watching world. This transition felt similar in many ways, another moment when their private relationship was forever intertwined with public duty. But they had learned over the years how to maintain their personal connection, despite the formal demands of their roles, and they drew on that experience now. The conversation moved to their children and the careful balance they would need to maintain between protecting their privacy and preparing them for their own future roles. George, as the future heir, would begin taking on more formal responsibilities in the coming years. Charlotte and Louis would also need guidance in understanding their place in the royal family and the expectations that came with their birth. William and Catherine had both experienced the challenges of growing up in the public eye, and they were determined to help their children navigate that path with as much support and normalcy as possible. As the night grew later, they found themselves talking about the Commonwealth tour that would mark their first major undertaking in their new roles. The itinerary included visits to Australia, New Zealand, and several Pacific Island nations, representing the global reach of the modern monarchy. It would be an opportunity to meet with leaders and citizens from across the Commonwealth, to understand their perspectives on the monarchy, and to demonstrate the continued relevance of the institution in the 21st century. They also discussed the causes and organizations they would champion in their new roles. Catherine's work in early childhood development would continue and expand, while William planned to focus on mental health awareness and environmental conservation. These were issues they both cared deeply about, and their new positions would give them unprecedented platforms to make a real difference in people's lives. The formal portraits that lined the walls of the Oak Room seemed to watch over their conversation. Generations of royal couples who had faced their own moments of transition and change. William thought about the challenges and triumphs those couples had experienced, the way they had adapted to changing times while maintaining the essential character of the monarchy. He and Catherine were now part of that continuing story, responsible for carrying it forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. As they prepared to end this private moment and return to their family, William and Catherine took a few minutes to simply be present with each other. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities and new challenges, but tonight they could appreciate the magnitude of what they had accomplished and the journey that had brought them to this point. The transition was complete, but their story together was just beginning a new chapter. The days following the transition brought a whirlwind of adjustments that touched every aspect of their daily lives. William woke each morning to briefings that now carried different weight and urgency. The red boxes that arrived at his desk contained matters of state that required his immediate attention, constitutional questions that needed careful consideration, and correspondence from world leaders who now viewed him as their primary contact within the British monarchy. Catherine found herself navigating a completely transformed schedule. Her private secretary's office had expanded overnight, with additional staff members needed to handle the increased volume of requests for her time and attention. Charitable organizations from around the world sought her patronage, understanding the global platform her new role provided. Every appearance she made, every cause she supported, would now carry greater significance and reach a much larger audience. The children adapted to the changes with the resilience that children often display, though there were moments that reminded William and Catherine of how profoundly their family life had been altered. George asked thoughtful questions about what his father's new responsibilities meant for their weekend plans and summer holidays. Charlotte noticed the increased security presence around their home and the more formal tone that staff members had begun using when speaking to her. Parents, the international response to the transition had been overwhelmingly positive, with messages of congratulations arriving from heads of state around the world. The Commonwealth Prime Ministers had issued a joint statement expressing their confidence in William's leadership and their commitment to working with him to strengthen the bonds between nations. European monarchs had reached out with personal notes of support, sharing their own experiences of taking on constitutional responsibilities. But it was the response from ordinary citizens that moved William and Catherine most deeply. Letters poured in from families across Britain and the Commonwealth, sharing personal stories and expressing hope for the future. Teachers wrote about using the transition as a way to teach their students about democracy and constitutional monarchy. Veterans shared memories of previous monarchs and their gratitude for the stability the institution provided. Young people wrote about their aspirations and their belief that William and Catherine represented a monarchy that understood modern challenges. The first major test came sooner than expected. A constitutional crisis emerged in one of the Commonwealth realms, requiring William to navigate complex political waters while maintaining the monarchy's traditional role of providing stability and continuity. The situation demanded careful consultation with government ministers, constitutional experts, and Commonwealth leaders. William found himself drawing on years of preparation and study, but also relying on instincts that had been shaped by watching his grandmother handle similar challenges with wisdom and grace. Catherine's first solo engagement in her new role took her to a children's hospital where she had been a patron for several years. The familiar environment provided some comfort, but she immediately noticed how differently people responded to her presence. The media coverage was more extensive, the security arrangements more complex, and the expectations from staff and patients notably higher. Yet she found that her genuine care for the children and families remained unchanged, and that authenticity helped her navigate the increased formality of her new position. The couple's first joint engagement was a state visit from the President of France, an event that required them to host formal dinners, participate in ceremonial exchanges, and engage in diplomatic conversations that could affect international relations for years to come. The preparation was extensive, involving briefings on trade relations, cultural exchanges, and political developments across Europe. William and Catherine found themselves studying not just protocol, but also complex policy matters that they would need to understand and discuss knowledgeably. Their private moments became even more precious during this period of intense adjustment. Evening walks through the castle grounds provided opportunities to decompress and share their experiences of the day. They talked about the challenges they were facing, the support they were receiving from staff and family, and the gradual process of growing into their new roles. These conversations helped them maintain perspective and remember why they had chosen to dedicate their lives to public service. The children's bedtime routine remained a sacred constant in their transformed lives. William and Catherine were determined that their new responsibilities would not prevent them from being present and engaged parents. Story time, homework help, and casual family dinners continued as before, providing stability for George, Charlotte, and Louis, while also giving William and Catherine a chance to remember the personal motivations behind their public commitments. Planning for the Commonwealth tour intensified during these weeks, with detailed discussions about the message they wanted to convey and the relationships they hoped to build. The tour would take them to nations that were experiencing their own political and social transitions, and William and Catherine understood the importance of demonstrating the monarchy's continued relevance and adaptability. They studied the history and culture of each country they would visit, wanting to show genuine respect and understanding For the diverse peoples who looked to the British Crown, the constitutional lawyers and private secretaries who advised them during this period were impressed by how quickly William and Catherine adapted to their expanded responsibilities. Years of preparation had provided them with strong foundations, but the actual experience of wielding constitutional authority and representing the nation required skills that could only be developed through practice. Their willingness to ask questions, seek advice, and learn from experienced advisors earned them respect within the royal household and government circles. Media attention remained intense throughout this adjustment period, with every public appearance analyzed for signs of how well they were adapting to their new roles. William and Catherine had learned over the years to maintain their composure under scrutiny, but the increased level of attention required additional mental preparation and support. They worked with communications experts to ensure their public messages were clear and appropriate, while also trying to maintain the warmth and accessibility that had made them popular with the British public. As the weeks passed, a new rhythm began to emerge in their lives. The initial overwhelming nature of the transition gradually gave way to a sense of purpose and growing confidence. William found himself more comfortable with the constitutional aspects of his role, while Catherine discovered new ways to use her platform to advance causes she cared deeply about. Together, they began to understand how their partnership could be strengthened rather than strained by their shared commitment to service. 3 months after the historic transition, William and Catherine found themselves standing on the balcony of Government House in Sydney, looking out over a crowd of more than 50,000 people who had gathered to welcome them to Australia. The Commonwealth tour had brought them to 5 nations over 3 weeks, and this final public appearance would mark the conclusion of their first major international undertaking in their new roles. The tour had exceeded every expectation. New Zealand. They had participated in a traditional Maori welcome ceremony that moved both of them to tears. The respect shown by Indigenous leaders, the careful attention to cultural protocols, and the genuine warmth of their reception had demonstrated the deep connections that still existed between these distant nations and the British Crown. William had delivered speeches in both English and Maori, a gesture that was widely appreciated and showed his commitment to understanding and honoring local traditions. In Fiji, they had witnessed the effects of climate change firsthand, visiting coastal communities that were already adapting to rising sea levels. Catherine had spent time with women's cooperatives that were working to preserve traditional crafts while creating sustainable livelihoods for their families. These conversations had reinforced her commitment to supporting grassroots organizations that empower communities to solve their own challenges while preserving their cultural heritage. The visit to Tonga had included a state dinner where William and Catherine had the opportunity to discuss regional security and economic development with Pacific Island leaders. These conversations had given them insights into the complex challenges facing small island nations and the role that the Commonwealth could play in supporting their development goals. William had been particularly impressed by the innovative approaches these nations were taking to renewable energy and sustainable fishing practices. Throughout the tour, they had been accompanied by British trade delegations and cultural representatives, turning their visits into opportunities for strengthening economic and educational partnerships. Universities announced new exchange programs, businesses signed cooperative agreements, and arts organizations planned collaborative projects. The soft diplomacy represented by their presence had opened doors for practical cooperation that would benefit all the nations involved. The media coverage of the tour had been overwhelmingly positive, with international outlets praising William and Catherine's genuine engagement with local communities and their evident preparation for each aspect of their visits. Photos of Catherine participating in traditional dances, William joining in community sports activities, and both of them listening intently to local concerns had been shared millions of times on social media, reaching audiences far beyond the countries they visited. But it was the private moments that had affected them most deeply. In Papua New Guinea, they had visited a remote village where they met families who had never seen representatives of the British monarchy, but who spoke with pride about their connection to the Commonwealth. An elderly woman had presented Catherine with a hand-woven shawl that represented months of work, explaining that it was a gift for the woman who would help her granddaughter have better opportunities in life. The children had remained in contact, throughout the tour through video calls that showed them following their parents' journey with excitement and curiosity. George had prepared a presentation about the countries they were visiting, using maps and photos to track their progress. Charlotte had started a collection of postcards and letters from each location, creating her own travel diary of the family's international experiences. Louis had simply enjoyed seeing his parents on screens around the world, though he didn't quite understand why so many people wanted to take their pictures. Now, as they prepared for their final public appearance of the tour, William and Catherine reflected on how much they had learned and grown over these 3 weeks. They had seen the Commonwealth not as an abstract concept, but as a living network of relationships between diverse peoples who shared common values and mutual respect. They had witnessed firsthand the challenges facing developing nations, the innovations being developed to address climate change, and the deep pride that people felt in their local cultures and traditions. The crowd in Sydney represented every aspect of Australia's multicultural society, with recent immigrants standing alongside families whose roots in the country went back generations. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives had honored William and Catherine with traditional ceremonies, while community leaders from dozens of ethnic backgrounds had shared their stories of building new lives while maintaining connections to their heritage. William's final speech of the tour addressed themes that had emerged throughout their travels. He spoke about the strength that came from diversity, the importance of protecting the environment for future generations, and the role that the Commonwealth could play in addressing global challenges through cooperation and mutual support. His words were broadcast live across all the nations they had visited, reaching an estimated audience of more than 100 million people. Catherine's remarks focused on the women and children she had met throughout the tour, sharing stories that illustrated both the challenges they faced and the remarkable resilience they had shown. She announced new initiatives that would provide educational support for girls in Pacific Island nations and funding for maternal health programs in rural communities. These commitments represented the practical outcome of the relationships she had built during their travels. As they waved farewell to the Sydney crowd and prepared to board the aircraft that would take them home, William and Catherine understood that they had successfully completed their first major test as international representatives of the modern monarchy. The tour had demonstrated their ability to connect with diverse audiences, to understand complex issues, and to represent British values while respecting local traditions and perspectives. The flight home provided time for reflection and planning. They reviewed the commitments they had made, the relationships they had established, and the follow-up actions that would be necessary to maintain the momentum created by their visit. They also talked about their children, eager to share stories and souvenirs from their travels and about the lessons they would take from this experience into their future work. Most importantly, they had proven to themselves and to the world that they were ready for the responsibilities they had accepted. The transition that had seemed so daunting just months before now felt like the natural beginning of a partnership that would serve the Commonwealth and the British people for decades to come. As their aircraft crossed the international dateline and began the long journey home, William and Catherine knew that they had not just completed a successful tour, but had taken the first steps toward defining the monarchy for a new generation.